Thanks everyone for joining. This is going to be a chat about some explorations that we've been doing on the OODA Loop lately. I'm going to start off with what's happened there. Never mind. So I'll start off with a bit of an introduction, a bit of history of the OODA Loop, a little bit of background on the exploration that we've done. Why is this important now, and then a little bit of what next afterwards. I hope the rest of my slides are in a better state than this. So the OODA Loop is obviously a concept that's gaining a lot of popularity in recent years. It was formulated by a chap called John Boyd, but it wasn't by any means the only piece of work that Boyd did, and the OODA Loop is almost a conglomeration of all of the things that Boyd studied and looked into. So here's a list of a few of the other things that he's done that are worthy of study. Destruction and creation in particular is my favorite. It's a tiny little six-page paper about, well, it's about cognition in my view. So many of the things much of the research that's being done on cognition now still bears remarkable resemblance to this little paper that Boyd wrote in 1976, which is amazing. So the OODA Loop, apologies. This is the OODA Loop, right? This is the diagram that Boyd drew sometime in the 90s, towards the end of his life. And it's not the kind of, we may have seen this. Oh man, slides all over the place. I do apologize.
They're looking good from here.
Yeah, they're just in the wrong order. So I'm just gonna zoom in here instead. So this is the OODA Loop that we often see, right? It's this, simplified circle: observe, orient, decide, act. It's like, like a stepwise function cycle that people go through. Boyd never drew anything like this. This is not the OODA Loop. This is a very, very simplified understanding of the OODA Loop that, and that's why I've put a big cross through it. So oh man, sorry about this. So Boyd's work actually comes down more to, sorry, did someone say something?
Do you want to, yeah, if you could make me co-host, I can mute people for you.
I thought I did.
I just muted all, and Ben, if you want to, there you go.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Cheers. Right. So Boyd's body of work basically comes down to three main principles: entropy, uncertainty, and incompleteness. So entropy is the second law of thermodynamics. It's the tendency of everything to move towards disorder. And I'm butchering the science completely for brevity here. Uncertainty is uncertainty pertains to the limits of observational accuracy. As your ability to observe approaches the granularity of your external environment, you start to observe chaotic or unexplainable behavior. And then incompleteness is the limits to internal consistency, right? There's always another point of view outside of our own that we need to move to if we want a complete view of the world. So that's the kind of the body of Boyd's work. And then the exploration that we've been doing has led me to sort of start thinking about like the limits of the way that we represent OODA. I think OODA is an incredibly useful, let's call it a mental model for want of a better word, but it suffers from, being formulated at a time where the best that we had for communicating these ideas was overhead projectors and crayons, essentially. So one of the aspects of this exploration that is ongoing, that I'll share some details of later, is that we want to try and think about ways of explaining the OODA Loop that is sort of faithful to the ideas, but paints a bit of a better picture. So one of the things that I've been playing with here is starting from action, because we always take an action. The whole point of OODA was about taking better action. So if we actually start from the action, really in the OODA you can start from anywhere when you start going through this through these cycles. But if we start from action and we say that action, when you take an action, it sets an expectation. You have a mental model about how that action is going to play out, and you have a mental simulation about the possible outcomes of that action. Setting the expectation then shapes your observation, because you're more likely to see what you expect to see, right? And there's when you don't see what you expect to see, right? If you're in a domain that's familiar to you and you expect a certain outcome from your action and something different happens, you get surprised. And surprise can do one of two things. It can either get you to change your mental model, or it can tip you into an intention to change the environment around you, such that the outside environment matches with your internal simulation, right? So at that point, you either go through this oh, I don't understand what happened here, and you think about it a bit, and you go up and down and in and out of your mental models, and you make a change, or the intention triggers a decision and an action, sometimes a decision, because there's no real requirement. If you're in a complex unfolding environment, like, actually what you want to be able to do is jump straight to action, right? You want to be familiar with the environment, that you bypass the decision altogether. And the example I come back to all the time is martial arts. If I'm rolling with somebody who's better at Brazilian jiu-jitsu than me, they will be jumping straight over decision, whereas I have to sort of stop and dither and think about what I'm going to do next. So this was iteration number one, and then we explored a little bit more, and then we've come to this what I'm calling the algorithm of adaptation. So one of the possible ways of looking at OODA that I think, from talking to some of Boyd's compatriots very briefly about this, I think this is one of the things that he was trying to move towards the end of his life, is thinking about everything as orientation. Orientation is without doubt the main point of the OODA loop. So what I'm trying to represent here is that we have this boundary. As any entity in an environment, we have the outside, we have the inside, and we have some sort of boundary or membrane across which actions flow outwards, and awareness or the situation and observations flow inwards. And those are your only contact with the environment. So in many places that I've worked recently, and I'm my background is technology, I'm a programmer, I've worked in startups and banks and whatnot. I think what happens is that when things get complicated and they change very quickly, we seal off the outside environment from ourselves by continually trying to reorientate on what we think we know, taking decisions, but never following those decisions through to an observable action or an observable result of that decision. So this is trying to represent that as an execution. We take action, those executions flow out into our environment, the things that we do, that we try and change the world to make it match our internal models. And then some of those will come back in some indeterminate form and flow into our observation in one form or another. That will become our experience. So there's lots of other things ongoing, obviously, and the things that we experience are a mix of the results of our actions and unfolding events, unfolding new information from the environment. And our job really is to go through this cycle of taking an action, observing the results of that action, orienting and changing our internal models where necessary, in order to build a better orientation and better model. And I believe that this is, and we can talk about this in the discussion at the end. I believe this is a model that can be applied not only to individual cognition, as a person going through the world and dealing with things, but I think this is also a general enough mental model that it can apply to businesses and teams and larger units of composed of, you know, essentially a team is a unit composed of individuals with their own OODA loops and their own internal models, and the team becomes a sum of the parts, the sum greater than the sum of the parts, I'm sorry, with when you have that kind of internal orientation and fluency of the team allows people to act with intuition. So why should we care about this? I'm ruining the surprise slightly by showing you the next slide. But you know, we, especially in the West, we've come to view the world as this kind of complicated but, you know, fairly logical puzzle, right? We look at the world as entities. We have a reductionist point of view. We look at systems to be maintained. It's the world of experts. It's efficient, and ultimately it's quite fragile. It's top down, and what the world really is complex. So rather than the things on the left, you know, the complexity of entities in the world comes from the connections between them, right? There are exponentially more connections between the entities in a system than there are entities themselves. When you start looking at the world through that lens, you can no longer be reductionist. You have to take a holistic point of view, because if you tweak one thing, you change multiple other things. You can no longer have a cause and effect mindset. You move away from this kind of idea of machines to be maintained to more kind of self-sustaining ecosystems that have their own energy flows and their own cycles. Experts sort of are still important, but you have to have an open mindset and be more of an explorer, I think. You know, even if you're an expert in something, the world changes so fast. An example of this, some work that I've been doing has made me really reconsider what's possible to build and what the right technical choices are to make in projects, because I had to re-look at what was available, and what I found was better than I thought was the kind of state of the art. And you know, moving away from building efficient, purely efficient systems to building effective systems. And you know, a good example of this is Google. As a talk by a chap called Mark Masterson, who used to work at Google, no longer does, I don't think. And he's talking about, you know, Google has lots and lots of redundancy, more than you might expect in a business that's been looking at sort of, you know, lean and flow-based optimization. And that's done on purpose, because, you know, effective systems are robust systems, and robust systems are those that have fail-safes and multiple different opportunities to do the same job. And then, you know, that lets us move away from the kind of fragility that we observe in today's world, where, you know, a rapid change ends up, you know, decimating half of the economy because it's all tightly coupled and not effective and not self-sustaining, and, you know, is considering the entities, and that enables us to build sort of more resilient systems and businesses. So the whole kind of OODA loop process is one of, you know, going into an unfamiliar domain and being confused or being unsure, here on the left. And as you go through multiple iterations, at multiple different time frames, you know, you go through the very quick kind of immediate actions, you go through strategic cycles in business, you eventually start to extract some clarity. And you know, when you've been operating in the clear domain for a while, you start to build some consistency, and this is where you've got enough familiarity in a domain that you can start building standard operating procedures, and you can start building a little bit of efficiency in. But all of that clarity and consistency is only enough to get you to the next level, and then this other kind of complexity emerges from the new things that have been built. And this is the cycle that's continually happening in technology, on increasingly short, with increasingly shorter tempo, right? We go through this process of understanding what's available, and then, you know, people are building more and more and more. So, you know, the way you would build a business now is completely different than even 5 years ago. And this will continue to get quicker, which is why I think an understanding of OODA and complexity is so important now, because ultimately this cycle that we go through, you know, to balance our kind of knowledge and our skills, right? You can come into a situation with zero skill and all the knowledge in the world, and you won't be able to do anything. And this was a mistake I learned when I started learning a different programming language. I read a ton of books, didn't actually write any code, and therefore my skill wasn't keeping up with my knowledge. And likewise, you can go into a situation with bags and bags of experience, but applying a little bit of abstracted knowledge or principles or you know, knowledge from different domains can show you where to tweak the skill. And both of those are a type of Charles, hold on, can we just I'm nearly done here. Can we just get to the end of this section, and then perhaps we'll do questions, because we've only got a little bit left. So, you know, both of these, the balance of skills and knowledge is a type of, you know, compression. Information gets abstracted and skills get practiced, and it's important to have this balance between knowledge and skills in order to build actual capability. Okay, so, oops, apologies. Right. So I mentioned that there's some exploration going on here. I'm working with Brian Rivera and Nigel Thurlow and a few other people to essentially do an exercise that Boyd described as building snowmobiles, which is taking apart different models, looking at new information. So I'll share the YouTube playlist that I mentioned here, which has those two videos of the five of us discussing all of this stuff and talking about the ideas behind the OODA loop, as well as a whole bunch of other explorations, including some videos of some of Boyd's compadres talking about OODA, and I'm also building a course on this called Algorithms for Leadership, which is aimed at translating the OODA loop and related concepts from that, you know, just happen to have emerged from the military situational awareness and mission command. So like I said, my background is technical. I happen to have served in the military, not for very long. I was a Royal Marine for 4 years, and I taught myself to code while I was in the Marines. And for a long time, I thought that, you know, the military was an interesting diversion in my early 20s that didn't really have much to say about the world anymore. But in discovering OODA and related concepts, I realized that actually there is an important intersection here, and this is something that I've used more and more in my own work. So I've built this course, which I'm going to be releasing soon. So I'll send some more details, and I'm actively looking for people to have a look at my landing page and you know, tell me if my language is good and review stuff for me. So if you're interested in doing that, I'd be great to hear from you. Any of these means will work. So Commando Dev on Twitter and LinkedIn, ben@commando.dev, and then this I will send these slides out, and I'll send some more information with a bunch of other links to papers and things like that. But that's the link for the playlist. So that's it for the slides. I apologize for the out of order display of them. Going to stop sharing the screen now, and we can jump into discussion. So yeah, feel free to unmute anyone, and oh, there's a good bit of chat going on here as well. So feel free to unmute and
excellent visuals.
Thank you, sir.
I see Art has their hand
one of
raised.
my one of my explorers.
What are you thinking about in terms of your marketing? Oh, sorry, Art had his hand.
Yes, Mark, wasn't it, had his hand up before?
Yeah, not sure who had the hand up. So first of all, thanks, Ben, for the session. Happy to review the landing page. Just wanted to share 2 applications of the OODA Loop because I agree it's super useful. One from creative advertising. In advertising school, we learned 2 modes of creative thinking. One is divergent, the other one is convergent. And if you overlay that over the OO and DA stages, that's pretty much kind of, opening yourself up to taking information in, making a decision, and then acting upon it. And the second step was in a organizational audit when we tried to figure out how and why a formerly co-located business failed to communicate once they had to switch to remote operation. And the first figure that you showed, so the original illustration of John Boyd with the various steps and the feedback segments. So what we identified was when you rely on the feedback segments being in-person communication, you move remote, and you suddenly don't have communication infrastructure. Suddenly all these information feedback cycles are lost. You still observe, you still orient, but nothing happens in between. And so it's like highly applicable on an organizational scale. So
yeah,
super
great
useful.
stuff. Great stuff. Yeah, I mean, that's spot on. And that's the reason why I mentioned destruction and creation. Yeah, it's a tiny paper and it exactly describes this kind of divergent and convergent patterns of thought. You destroy your existing models. And, the reason I actually love this is my own background as a programmer. That I belong to an unusual little subculture of programming called functional programming, which is very mathematics based. And there's this really principled model of programming based on folds and unfolds, which are destruction and creation. So fold is a destruction, creation is an unfold, and actually that algorithm underlies a huge amount of machine learning and everything else. So I found that link really interesting. Who had their hand up next? I'm sorry, I can't see an ordered list of people. Mr. Fox.
Again, lovely presentation, Ben.
Thanks. Sorry
2
about the
questions.
slides.
One of them very quick. So it sounded like you were using the language from Kinevin there. Was that deliberate?
So the complicated and complexity, yes. I wasn't really using them in a sort of strict Kinefin-y sense, but many of the people, including Chris, who's on the call, who we've been doing the exploratory with, are very heavily into Kinefin, and obviously Ponch and Dave have been exploring the overlaps and relationships between OODA and Kinefin. So yeah, I'm definitely aware of very strong overlaps for sure.
Great. And the second question was, what do you think is the overlap between Boyd's OODA loop and Stewart's cycle and the work of Deming of the Plan, Do, Check, Act?
So I'm definitely going to have to concede on this one. I've got Deming's book up on my shelf, but I haven't read it. Although I know Mark, who's on the call, Mark's got a bit of an opinion on this.
This
I
one?
think. Yep, that's the one. That's the one I've got and not
Fantastic
read.
book.
Yeah, I definitely need to get to Deming at some point. What do you think?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not an expert in the OODA loop, but it sounds like there's a lot of overlap. What Deming is describing is principally the scientific method, right? It's hypothesize, construct an experiment, observe the results of that experiment, conduct an analysis, come to a conclusion, and then decide what you do next. So it seems similar. If it's still around cognition. I think there are maybe some differences, but I don't know enough about OODA in order to be able to like figure out what those differences are.
Yeah, so I think actually something's coming back to me that when Punch, Dave, and all went to they went to look at Boyd's archives, and they found some scribbled notes. I think Mark, if you're still on the call, I think Mark might have some bit more insight into it. They say they found some notes in the, because Mark will have actually seen these documents himself, I believe. So Mark, you want to jump in and take this, because I know there were some notes on Boyd's thoughts on Deming, right?
He did take a lot of notes, and I have it somewhere. I know that Ponch had put that out, and it's been a while since I've looked at it. But the way I would answer it briefly, because it would take hours, I think, to really rip it apart, is that Deming systems would, I would say, from a Boyd standpoint, would reside inside one's orientation. It'd be another methodology, another experience, another something that I'd been educated on that would help implicitly guide and control my observations, my decisions, and my actions. Whereas I think that Deming's is more maybe prescriptive, and I always, you and I have talked a lot about this, that Boyd is, to me, it's less of a mental model. It's more of a diagnostic map of how orientation actually works, and that orientation is really the key component of what's pitted against something else. It's two orientations, and like Deming, like Kinevin, and other things, those would be components of my orientation that would in turn implicitly guide and control how I observe, have a direct effect on how I decide, and then also implicitly guide and control how I would act in a time scale.
Yeah,
in the 30-second version.
yeah.
Thank you.
And for anyone wondering, that is actually Mark's wall. That's not a Zoom backdrop. That is actually all of Mark's books.
I actually did a talk yesterday, Ben, and that came up. People were asking about things like plan, do, check, act, other types of procedural things. And the way I answered is that like our previous experiences and other educations and things that we've done, that would reside as a frame of reference within our orientation that would shape how we operate. Or the way I describe it sometimes to people to help them, maybe from a layman standpoint, is that technology mimics nature, and think of the internal operating system or the iOS of your iPhone, PDCA or Deming or Kinevin or anything. Those are all things that I upload into my iOS, which help it go through the process of making observations, decisions, and actions, and then learning from it. The loop, the learning.
Yeah, that's the one thing that machines can't do, right? Is the generalized learning side of things. That's the one algorithm that we still have that machines do not as yet. Yangbo, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, just very quickly, thanks for saying this. It's glad that the notion of divergent and convergent was brought up, since much of it paralleled with what has been in vogue much of the past decade regarding design thinking, that approach of really rapid prototyping and all these terms. And what I had wondered is really how much of this overlap, these parallels, how much of that was intentional versus based on or disjunct, as in they saw similar phenomena and then they started coming up with processes that to an outside observer just happen to be quite similar, even if they were not actually in the same context, the same space, or even the same time period. So just quite compelled by this genealogy, this pedigree of these strands of thinking, these praxes and all that sort of different design thinking, rapid prototyping, human-centered designs, all those terms. Wondering, did that all come from Boyd, or were there other sources Boyd drew from, the cross-pollination? Just quite fascinated about that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the thing about Boyd, right? People mention that he was a military guy, but he was incredibly broadly read, right? He didn't come up with the OODA from thin air, and I find it continually amazing. I mean, he passed away in '97, and the amount of, essentially a Cambrian explosion of further research and understanding of cognition and all of this stuff that's happened in the interim sort of quarter of a century. When you think about the last quarter of a century and how much change there's been, it's absolutely insane to me that his ideas still map so well to, things that are coming out about how the brain actually functions. And so, yeah, I guess it's no surprise that I think his views map, really, really well to lots of these things, right? Or to put it more accurately, there's some hidden principles and abstractions that are common across all of these things, right? It's not like, this one's better than this one or this one's better than that one. It's that they're all converging on a really, a really good fundamental understanding of the world. Great question. Glenn, hello, sir. How are you?
Oh, mate, thanks for the invite, Bro. I love the presentation. I thought it was excellent, bringing everything together and just making the principles a lot more concise, especially with the graphics. I have one question about kind of scaling from this as a concept that guides individual intuitions and behaviors up to kind of, the assertion that we can use this in teams and stuff like that, just from kind of like a pragmatic point of view for people who are less interested in this as an abstract concept and more like, how do I get a whole team of people to use this to get to do things? You don't want to kind of drag it back to the stupid linear OODA thing that people have tried to apply to teams. So how do you address the concept of orientation when it comes to teams, when each individual within the team will be oriented slightly differently based on their intrinsic knowledge and skill and experience? There's feed forward there, right? They're all looking for different things. So you can sort of put up the big banner saying, here's what we're doing as a business, and here's the goal, and here's the mission statement, but they all come to it with their own feed forward mechanisms, right? So this is not like a challenge to it. I'm just sort of saying, is there anything in the course where you're going to kind of address that for people who look at this and then be like, this is lovely, how do I use it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. And I swear to God, Glenn's not a plant, everyone, because I'm about to,
I'm really not.
to say some things.
Yeah.
So yes, and I can see we've got Marcel on the call as well, who I'm sure will have some opinions about what I'm about to say. So one of, the reason that I kind of came back to the military side of things, having spent a long time in technology, is that leadership in the military is done a very particular way, right? It's less about a skill and it's more about a system, right? The system of leadership in the military is called mission command. It's a huge part of Boyd's inspiration, and it's a very particular kind of way of structuring communications such that you build that shared understanding of what's going on. And is my camera frozen? Sorry. So I think the key for getting people working in that kind of aligned way is, you never get them lined up 100% because everyone's an individual, but it's kind of like, I think Elon Musk has this analogy that I'm sure he probably stole from somewhere else, of thinking of people as vectors, right? So you've got a vector which has a direction and a magnitude. As long as you've got those directions pointing roughly in the right direction, the sum of all those vectors is something that points in the right direction. The problem comes when you've got everyone pointing scattered all over the place. So I think that's why, like I mentioned that I'm building a course. For me, the execution side of things is mission command, and the execution side of things is the bit where you have all of your planning, the bit where you have all of your organizational Brownian motion, from Mr. Fox in the chat there, I love it. So you've got the situational awareness, which is the flow of information into the system, and then you've got, okay, we're going to go and do something. And like Glenn and I in the YouTube YouTube playlist I mentioned, there's about 3 hours of Glenn and I talking about this. So we've covered it off fairly well from the individual point of view and from the kind of the martial arts point of view. But I think the mission command is the missing piece of how you do that with a group of people and integrate the different, you know, crazy things happening in the environment and everything else. Great question. Adam.
Hi, Ben. Yeah, I'd like to reiterate, found it super useful. Found the graphics, the way that it was visualized was really helpful for me as well. I was like, I'm very new to OODA, and I was stuck thinking about it in the very kind of the loop that had the big red X to it. But I think my question is very similar to the previous one. We're looking to implement this in a small startup, about 12 people or so. And it was just thinking about, is this something that you need to train each individual on, or is it something where management really directs it and then is just feeding out actions to the rest of the organization? So is it a centralized or is it a decentralized kind of management process? And how do you, if you have a decentralized where each person is making their own actions based on the information that they're getting input, how do you sync up those cycles between different teams?
Brilliant question. So there's several different things going on in that question, right? You're 12 people, you're a startup, which presumably means that you're expanding that team. So there's several different things that need to be navigated here. One is figuring out what the hell the goal of the startup is. Like, I'm assuming that, you know, product market fit is you know, you're some way along a trajectory from established. You know, you definitely know what you're doing. You've got this kind of, you know, you're solidly understanding that you've got a product that will work. I would assume at 12 people, you're probably going to be changing that quite a lot. So there's basically integrating that situational awareness that you're getting from your environment. It's integrating new information. You're also growing in people because you've got more people joining all the time. So that's the kind of, you know, your culture changes as each new person joins, right? If you're 100 people and one new person joins, you know, probably no great shakes, right? It's not a massive jump, but, you know, 12 people and one person joining, you know, is a big change. And then you've also got this thing that you can also learn a little bit from the military on. You've got a social inflection point coming up, right? You're going to go from one team to multiple teams fairly soon, I should think, probably around sort of 16, 20 people. The way your communications have to work just through the dynamics of interpersonal links means that you'll have to have some structure. So all of those things mean that, you know, this is where the mission command starts coming in, the commander's intent starts coming in. Dunbar's number, as Foxy says in the chat. So this is one of the reasons why startups are such a chaotic, difficult environment to work in, and increasingly so because the speed we scale through these inflection points is shortening rapidly. So, you know, what used to take a year or two to build, you know, look at examples like Hopin. You know, it went from 0 or, you know, one person to 300 in less than a year, right? So the scale at which we change our team structures is unprecedented, right? That just doesn't happen. So, I mean, that's a bit of a waffly answer, and I'm more than happy to chat over email with some specifics. It's a bit difficult to give specific answers, but yeah, short answer, yes. I think OODA is a useful model for reasoning about all this stuff, for sure.
Thanks for that. I'll probably drop you a message as well afterwards with some a little bit more specifics.
Yeah, please do.
Thanks.
Does anybody else have anything I'd like to add, ask? I'm just going to have a quick look back through the chat while I've been flapping my gums. Yeah, so Mark's put a reference into 933, Boyd, the fighter pilot who loathed lean. That's where you can find some clues about Deming and Boyd in the OODA loop. So I think we'll probably wrap up there if nobody's got any more questions. So as I said, I'm part way through building out the kind of the landing page and the marketing for my course. If any of this resonated and you are in a position of, working in a tech company that's experiencing problems, I'd love to hear from you, because I'm really keen to make sure that what I'm building in the course is not just what I've experienced as a technology person, but just that it's using the right kind of way to describe it to people that haven't spent several years geeking out on entropy and other weirdness when it comes to people. My contact details, I will email everyone the slides after the session, but yeah, there's my email is ben@commando.dev, which Ben's just chucked in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Yeah, if that's everything, I will wrap it up there. Thank you very much for coming.
I have a suggestion. Are you going to put up a mailing list or forum or Slack or something where?
Yeah, I have. I've got a landing page. That will be just a few things to finish off there, and then I'll be sharing that across all the channels. So obviously follow me on Twitter for those of you who do that sort of thing. It's @CommandoDev, and I will send an email to everyone when the landing page is ready as well. So everyone who's signed up for this session, obviously I've got emails and whatnot. So I'll email out the details as and when. And yeah, if anyone ever wants to chat about this stuff, my door is always open. I'm always happy to geek out and nerd out on OODA Loop and related concepts. Okay, thanks everyone.
Yeah, very cool.
Thank you.
Very cool.
Cheers, folks.